In 1976, country singer Johnny Sands was in Las Vegas, Nevada, promoting his latest record. Sands was a pretty accomplished country singer, appearing on the Today Show, and also singing in shows with country music legends like Charlie Daniels and Merle Haggard. In addition to this, Sands also worked as a stuntman, magician, and escape artist. However, there would be no escape from what came for him. In January 1976, his case is considered quite credible, as hundreds would see UFOs in the sky that night, and Sands would pass a polygraph as well. In this episode, we will examine this close encounter of the third kind, the case of Johnny Sands. On January 29th, 1976, Johnny Sands hopped in his car leaving Las Vegas so he could drive and promote his record and also explore some older western towns. After a long day, Sands left the town of Pahrump, located about an hour outside of Las Vegas, and began heading home around 10 p.m. Sands hopped on the Blue Diamond Road, and around 10:30 p.m. he would spot a strange craft in the sky. He was pretty preoccupied at the moment though, thinking about his music, and initially ignored the craft. The craft would then follow him for around 3 miles, when suddenly his engine started sputtering, and he pulled over on the shoulder. He started checking the car, making sure he wasn't out of gas, or there wasn't a problem with the engine, and at that moment, forgot completely about the UFO. Then, Johnny Sands would see something he would never forget. Around 1,000 feet in the air, Sands spotted the craft. It was around 60 feet long, oval-shaped, and had a burnt orange color. As well, it had a large ring around it. In the ring, there were portholes around 10 feet in diameter and around 5 feet apart. Between each porthole, there was a light and lights on the end, flashing white. The craft moved over a nearby mountain, lighting up the entire area. At this point, Sands was pretty scared and decided to get back to work, fixing his car. He tried removing several things and inspecting them, but had no luck. Then he turned back around, and he spotted several humanoids in his headlights down the road. In a frightening turn of events, Sands froze and couldn't move. It appears the beings had paralyzed him. The beings then approached, with one coming around 3 feet away, while the other stopped at about 5 feet. The beings were around 5'8", 140 pounds, and looked incredibly strange. Sands would state that these pale creatures had something on the sides of their face that resembled gills. Even more odd, the gills seemed to move incredibly quickly on their face. They were bald, with no eyebrows, and had small black eyes with white pupils, and also had a flat nose, which Sands would compare to a pug's nose. The skin was extremely wrinkled, something we see in other cases like this. The beings wore silver coveralls that had a white strap that ran from their shoulder to their waist. They also had another belt around their waist with different types of gadgets on them. What happened next would truly be shocking. A conversation would ensue, with Sands asking some questions and the beings asking some as well. They communicated through telepathy. It's important to note at the time the APR report was written, the beings would threaten Sands, saying if he revealed the whole conversation of which occurred, they would come for him. In a later interview with Brent Rains, around 30 years later, Sands would reveal the details he was asked not to discuss. According to Sands, for around a 10-minute period, the beings and Sands would communicate, with Sands asking the first question, "Where did you come from?" The beings pointed up to the sky and didn't say a word. The being would then ask Sands what he was doing there. Sands responded he was in Las Vegas and doing a record, and that he was a country music singer. The creature then asked, why were so many people in Las Vegas? Sands stated it was a tourist town and that people came to Las Vegas from all over. Sands was then asked, what is your means of communication? He didn't understand the question really. The being seemed to become angry and stated, answer the question. Once again though, a frightened Sands repeated that he didn't understand the question. The humanoid turned to the other at this point, and the beings seemed to be communicating something to one another, although it's not clear what. This lasted 2 to 3 minutes. It should be pointed out once again the being's mouths didn't move, and they communicated with Sands through telepathy. The beings then turned around and warned Sands once again about seeing them, stating, "Don't say anything about this meeting. We know where you are, and we'll see you again." In the interview with Brent Rains in 2009, Sands would state the being pulled out a small ball that grew into the size of a basketball and had sparks flying all around it. Next, the being said, "You see, nuclear explosions are causing a problem in the solar system. These things that you're setting off on this Earth are causing troubles not only for you, but for us, and we cannot have this kind of thing to continue because it's going to upset the balance of everything that we intend for the future." Sands was confused as he was an entertainer and didn't know almost anything about the topic. He next asked if the beings were evil, to which it responded, "Harm comes from evil." Sands would ask their age, to which the creature responded, "We are before the beginning of what you know as time." The being would go on to say they would see him again in time, and he would understand the reason. It doesn't appear that the beings kept their promise, as the 2009 interview with Brent Rains didn't reveal further contact. After the 10-minute conversation, they walked off into the night, and a white flash lit up the sky. The beings then disappeared. After this, Sands went to the Air Force Base in the area and was referred to the APRO. There he would converse with John Romero, who would ask him to take a polygraph. At the time, Sands was in a bit of a predicament. Hundreds, possibly thousands, saw strange lights that night, and word was circling around town around his experience. Sands didn't want people to think his story was all a publicity stunt and had to manage telling his story along with also promoting his record. Eventually, the APRO would arrange for him to take a polygraph with Dr. R.L. Nolan and pass. Dr. Nolan was an FBI agent with over 27 years of experience administering the test. One interesting thing did happen in the test, though. The test showed that Sands was holding back something. It's important to point out he was not lying. For decades, Johnny would not talk about some of the things the beings asked him not to discuss. Decades later, according to Johnny Sands, the beings would tell him that night that the governments and militaries around the world were aware of their existence. It's important to note the beings didn't say what the relationship was between the two. What can we make of this incredible close encounter of the third kind? There's quite a bit to unpack from this case. Probably the first thing to note here is that the being's appearance was definitely strange and not the typical gray or Nordic alien. That said, there are other cases with people reporting very wrinkly beings, and of course many cases of entities warning about the dangers of nuclear weapons. There's quite a bit of supporting evidence, even though Sands was all alone. Many saw a UFO or lights in the Las Vegas area in the sky that night. Also, Sands passed a lie detector, and his story was considered credible by the APRO. In addition to this, Sands had a lot to lose, as he was doing well, and this could sink his career. Some debate this, though, as he was an entertainer and didn't have a career like a politician, which relied on reputation. One other similarity as well with the other cases we see is his car dying without reason. We see this time and time again. Still though, in examining the APR report versus the 2009 Rains interview, there does appear to be minor discrepancies. First, in the Rains interview, Johnny stated that the being spoke through telepathy. However, in the APRO report, it seems to imply the being's words came through them, like as if it was coming out of their bodies. It's important to note that the APRO report stated the entities did not move their mouths, and we might be misinterpreting the communication method in the report. One other thing to point out, there was no mention or worries around nuclear programs in the original APRO report. It's pretty well known in 2009 that ETs are concerned over nuclear weapons based on numerous reports. In all fairness, he may have been told to not discuss this though. Sands also stated he underwent hypnosis in the 2009 interview, but the APRO bulletin stated he did not and was afraid of hypnosis. Once again, though, he might have done hypnosis later on. Later, Johnny appeared to have some run-ins with the men in black. He stated on one occasion a man told him the gills from the beings were because the beings were semi-aquatic. The strange man would tell him that these beings were from around the star Sirius. Why was Johnny selected to meet the beings? There was never a reason given to him. However, we speculate that Johnny's heritage may have been a factor. Johnny Sands is a Native American, and perhaps with a culture very spiritual in nature, one of his ancestors had contact with the beings. Johnny Sands was no ordinary man. He worked as a stuntman, escape artist, singer, and much more. In 1983, he broke the world record for the fastest straitjacket escape artist in the world with a record speed of 79 hundredths of a second. In 2004, he stayed in a stainless steel glass topped casket that was submerged under 600 gallons of water and appeared at fairs throughout the eastern United States. He was inducted into the Houdini Hall of Fame in Niagara Falls. As a stuntman, he performed over 15,000 movie stunts, being in movies with legends like Elvis. Despite this, his night in Vegas in January 1976 would be the most significant event of his life. He still goes and stares at the sky, looking for the beings, and talks out loud, asking them to return and talk with him. Maybe one day he will speak with them once again. It's been speculated by some that hybrid human-alien beings walk among us. Often, it is thought these beings look just like humans, except perhaps having a few peculiar characteristics, such as different eyes. In addition to this, the beings are said to usually possess odd personality traits, such as their speech, posture, and gestures. Every so often, though, a case arises where human-like beings are spotted, and it's fairly obvious they are not of this planet. In this episode, we will dive into a story from the state of Missouri in which hotel workers encountered something while working. In time, this little-known case has come to be known as the 1970 Simson Incident. On May 15, 1970, Missouri resident Dorothy Simpson was working at her job, a hotel front desk clerk in the suburbs of St. Louis. The night had been fairly typical and somewhat slow for Dorothy. She had performed her usual tasks, such as checking billing statements, checking in guests, and answering phone calls. However, her night was about to get much more strange. Sometime during the evening, Dorothy was looking down and would hear a strange whistling sound. She looked up and would be surprised to see 4 humanoids standing right in front of her. The scene was bizarre, to say the least. There were 4 beings whose appearance was very peculiar. They were all very short, about as tall as the desk, which was around 3.5 feet. There was a man, a woman, a boy, and a girl. All looked very similar, as if they were part of the same family. The 2 males wore tailored suits, and the females wore peach dresses. The hair looked faked on all the entities, and Dorothy would later say she thought they were all wearing wigs. Their skin was pale and the beings' eyes looked lifeless. In sum, the beings seemed to possess enough characteristics to pass as humans, but anyone who really looked at them knew they clearly weren't. The man then spoke in a high-pitched tone and stated,
"Do you have a room to stay?"
Dorothy responded they did have rooms and informed them of the price. The strange man, though, didn't seem to understand what she had said. He turned toward his family and looked, trying to see if they understood, yet none did. The beings then all just looked back and stared at Dorothy. It's not clear what happened here, if they were trying to read her thoughts or hoping she would just hand the keys. Dorothy remained quiet though, and there was an uncomfortable silence. The man finally reached into his pocket and pulled out a stack of $20 bills and put it on the table. The bills though looked brand new, and Dorothy suspected they might be counterfeit. She quickly tested them, but they proved to be genuine. Dorothy took $40 to cover the stay and gave back the rest of the money to the man. She next asked him to sign his name, but the man was so short he couldn't sign it on the desk. Dorothy asked his name, to which he replied, A. Bell, and Dorothy signed it for him. At this point, the man would step forward. Dorothy, who usually wore glasses, hadn't had them on at this point. As he got closer, she could make out more details on his face. It was very strange and looked doll-like. She asked the man, "Where are you from?" The small man looked upward and pointed toward the sky, saying, "We are from up there." Right as he was saying it, though, the woman stepped in, pushing his hand down, and said, "We are from Hammond, Indiana," giving a street address as well. Then the woman would ask if there was anywhere to eat, and Dorothy showed them where the hotel restaurant was. At this point, the beings walked over to the restaurant, and other members of the hotel staff began to notice the beings. The manager in particular noticed them and went back to speak with Dorothy about her interaction. Dorothy showed the names and addresses they had given, and the manager insisted she look it up to see if they were real. After doing this, Dorothy and her manager would discover the address and the name were both fake. During this time, another employee would go into the parking lot looking for their car with an Indiana tag. He wouldn't find any though. The strange being surely stuck out in the restaurant. The adult's chin barely reached the table. In addition, their mannerisms and conversations with the hostesses and servers was extremely bizarre. For example, the man would ask where the bread and milk came from. The beings would eventually order milk and peas, along with one small steak for the small man. Even more strange, though, was how they ate. The beings would use their knife and pick up peas individually, essentially stabbing them and putting them in their mouth. While eating, they made a loud sucking sound. The man at one point struggled to get down the steak, even though it was cut up into very small pieces. After they ate, they handed the server a $20 bill, and when she returned with their change, they had all disappeared. The server had clearly explained the cost and billed to the group. Soon they would be found by the elevator, but the family was extremely frightened to go inside it. The bellhop had to assure them it was safe to get in. The bellhop escorted them to their room, and when they went in, he turned on the light, but then the man started yelling at the bellhop, telling him that the light is going to damage the children's eyes. The bellhop was so scared at this point, he ran out of the room and went down to tell the manager and Dorothy of his experience. The employees all convened in the hotel lobby, discussing the strange guests. They agreed to watch them depart the next day and see if they could find anything else about them. The next morning, the guests were nowhere in sight. Eventually, staff knocked on the door, and upon entering, there was no one to be found. This was especially confusing to the hotel staff, as there was only one door in and out, and each time it opened, it alerted the front desk. One member of the staff would eventually reach out to ufologist John Schroeder, who was based out of St. Louis. Schroeder would visit the hotel and interview the staff that interacted with the beings. He would state they all sounded genuine and was of the opinion that they were telling the truth. What can we make of this strange case and the being's intentions? It seems more likely than not that something not human visited the hotel that evening. By all accounts, the being's behavior seemed pretty typical of what we would expect. The men wore formal clothing, had trouble communicating, had no car, and didn't understand where food came from. In addition, the man seemed to accidentally state where they were from. The beings also seemed to disappear from the hotel without a trace. One other thing to point out too is that multiple employees reported the same thing. Still, critics of the case have another theory, that the parents were simply dwarfs and that the beings were foreign, who had difficulty speaking English. Critics say the four were simply out-of-towners and that the hotel staff blew the strangeness out of proportion. For the food question, perhaps they wondered what part of the country or which farm supplied the food. While critics bring up some good points, it doesn't explain everything though, like where was their car and also the appearance. Dwarves' faces look human, and all the witnesses reported these beings to have very strange physical characteristics, resembling dolls. Assuming the four were not of this world, this then raises the question around their motivation. Were these ETs simply on a fact-finding journey, or some kind of experiment to see what checking into a hotel was like? It certainly seems possible, and a hotel in a pretty desolate area outside St. Louis seems like a pretty good place to try it. There seems to be more and more cases and evidence where these beings want to learn human culture as well as do experiments. In the future, we'll cover more of these interesting cases where beings appear to be trying to learn aspects of human civilization. In 1940, a bizarre and little-known alien encounter would happen at Abitibi Lake, which is located in northeastern Ontario and western Quebec, Canada. Around 2:30 p.m. on January 8th, two lumberjacks named Hernais and Depew were in the midst of a tough workday when they would decide to take a much-needed break. As such, they cut off some tree branches and sat down in the snow, planning on resting for a short while and then finishing up their workday. As the two men sat, rested, and talked, they would soon spot an enormous white wolf walking around. The wolf didn't seem interested in the two, but appeared confused. Then, as if it were commanded to do so, the wolf walked around 100 feet to the men and sat down in the snow. It was surely a strange scene, but things were about to get much more bizarre. Right behind the fir trees, 6 humanoids appeared, stunning the two witnesses. The beings were very small, all appearing exactly the same and wearing dark green puffy suits and being around 2.5 feet tall. They had small slanted eyes, ears that were shaped like an upside down triangle, small chins and flat heads. The two witnesses would state they all looked identical, as if they had all rolled off the assembly line. While the wolf was quite docile at this point, things were about to change. The wolf then spotted the 6 beings and immediately stood up, becoming angry. The hair on its back stood and the wolf growled, showing its teeth. At this point, the beings looked over in the direction of the lumberjacks, but strangely seemed to look past them as if they didn't see them. Next, they looked at the wolf and pointed their fingers at it, speaking among each other. Their language was bizarre, something the men had never heard. It was very fast, and Depew would later state it sounded similar to Algonquin. The group continued talking, and soon one of the beings would begin to approach the wolf. Interestingly, the men noted that none of the humanoids wore snowshoes, but were able to walk right on the snow, not sinking. The being walked right up to the wolf, raised its hand, and began speaking to it. Things would not go as planned for the little alien, though. The wolf aggressively reacted by jumping at the being and ripping it apart. After this, Depew broke off a branch and threw it at the wolf, screaming, and eventually the wolf ran off. The 5 other beings then walked up to the corpse of the dead alien and began to pick up what was left. According to the witnesses, the sight was quite grotesque, and Hernais even threw up. The beings then grabbed the corpse of the alien and quickly fled into the woods. Hernais and Depew chased the beings, following their footsteps, but couldn't catch them as they walked too fast. They eventually came to a spot where the footsteps ended, In the snow, the two men could see a circular pattern, indicating a UFO probably landed, and the beings were picked up. The men then headed back to the spot where the alien was attacked and would find a piece of the being's suit and also brown blood. Quebec ufologist Donald Sir would investigate the accident years after it occurred. It appears, though, he didn't speak with the men directly, but family members who did confirm the story did happen. What can we make of this incredible close encounter of the third kind? Probably the most incredible part of this story is the wolf attacking the alien. It seems pretty unrealistic that ETs, with all their technology, couldn't protect themselves from a wolf. Still, it's very possible that these beings in the story were not biological in nature and were actually robots. As such, we can speculate that, similar to how humans use drones to collect information, perhaps whatever was in the UFO sent these humanoids down to gather information and wasn't concerned about their well-being. It's not known what happened to the two men in this story, but by all accounts, since the family didn't disclose anything else, they probably moved on with their lives. Perhaps the most famous UFO abduction story involves a couple driving on a dark, desolate highway. In 1961, the story of Betty and Barney Hill shocked the nation as the couple recalled the strange events that took place that night. While the Hills story is still popular today, the environmental characteristics reported in their story we see far too often. Individuals often spot UFOs in remote areas and often at night. In this story, we will cover a witness who had a close encounter of the third kind in New York in 1958. Furthermore, this story is particularly intriguing because of what the witness saw, something truly bizarre. In January 1958, a woman serving in the U.S. Army took leave and decided to drive to see her son, who was then 18 years old. The woman was driving on the New York Thruway Highway. Today, the New York State Thruway is a 570-mile toll road system that runs across New York State, connecting major cities, rural areas, and tourist destinations. Back in 1958, though, the Thruway wasn't as popular as today, and that night, weather conditions would make things even more difficult. There was a heavy snowstorm occurring, and having limited visibility, the witness was having trouble seeing down the highway. Then around 1:30 a.m. local time, up ahead the woman would make out a large shape in the center of the road. The witness couldn't make out exactly what it was and thought initially it was an airplane wreck. As she kept approaching, though, her car motor started to die down, and soon the witness's car lost power. She tried several times to restart the car, but had no luck. The woman was now without power and sitting in the darkness. To make things more frightening, up ahead, she spotted something strange. The object ahead was a slim rod, or pole, that was illuminated around 50 feet high. Even more strange, it kept getting shorter, as if it were sinking into the ground. At this time, the stunned witness was going to hop out to get a better look, but then something unbelievable happened. Two entities began rising next to the shrinking pole. The entities didn't look humanoid, but appeared like animals with 4 legs, a tail, and 2 front feelers under their head, similar to arms. The beings appeared to be moving around the poles, although it's not clear what they were doing. Then suddenly the entities would disappear, and the rod would begin to rise up. The witness could now see that there was a saucer-shaped UFO. It rose up around 10 feet off the ground, and then quickly flew away in the night sky. Once it flew away, the witness was able to restart her car again. Before she drove away, though, she walked over to the spot where the pole had went. The pole had gone in the median, and she could see the grass as the snow had melted. The rod had not dug a hole in the ground, though. That night, the witness decided to pull over and stay at a local motel. The next day, as she returned to her son's house, she told her son and other family members about the event. They were stunned and persuaded her not to report it. For some time, she didn't. Eventually, though, she did. The witness later relayed the story to ufologists Jacques Vallée and Otto Binder, as well as Fortean Times magazine. Vallée particularly noted how convinced she was something had happened to her. What can we make of this bizarre alien encounter? There are several things that appear to stand out. First, the beings weren't humanoids. There's been many reports of alien encounters, but almost always the beings are humanoid in appearance. Usually gray or Nordic aliens are reported, but even other reports of bizarre creatures most of the time appear humanoid. These beings had 4 legs though. Still, it's reasonable to assume that beings or aliens with 4 legs do exist and are out there. It could also be the case, of course, these strange entities were some type of drone-like device collecting information or samples. The second thing that stands out in this case is the pole that went down to the ground. It seems like, based on the details, the ship might have been able to transform its shape. That, or possibly the witness was so fixated on the UFO she didn't actually spot it. Regardless, the event was surely atypical, as usually people report a beam of light shot down. In the story, it seems the pole was used as the teleportation or transportation device. All this said, this was surely a fascinating story, and one very unique. In 1977, a bizarre alien encounter would happen in the city of West Pittsburgh, California. The case is considered to be highly credible, as it was investigated by multiple ufologists and noted to be one of the best in the year 1977. Before diving into the case, it's important to point out, too, the boy's unbelievable story came out before the popular movie Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind. This is significant because once the movie was released, there was a spike in alleged UFO sightings around the country. In time, this case has come to be known as the 1977 West Pittsburgh alien encounter. On May 20th, 1977, 3 boys, all ages 14, named Lenny Young, George Ferreira, and Patrick Morrison were hanging out, walking around the Santa Fe Railroad tracks around the marsh of Suisun Bay. Up to this point, the night had been uneventful for the 3, and as such, they decided to start heading over to a spot known as the Pump House. The Pump House was a castle-like structure complete with a moat and a bridge, which pumped the fresh water out of the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta for the treated water division of the Contra Costa County Water District. In addition to this, it was a popular spot for young locals to hang out. The trio considered hitchhiking to the pump house, but instead opted to walk, cutting across a big field. This decision would be something that would change their lives forever. As the boys began walking, they suddenly spotted something up in the sky. The boys noticed first the lights. It had red lights going around it, and in between these red lights, there were blue lights that were flickering intermittently. The object appeared to be silver and had a classic UFO shape, being disc-shaped. At the time, the craft was around 100 feet away, when it would soon slowly descend to the ground. As the UFO touched down, the craft went dark, and in the darkness across the field, the boys saw 3 creatures coming toward them. As mentioned, the area was dimly lit, only getting light from 2 distant streetlights. The boys would describe the beings to be stiff-like robots surrounded by smoke and around 5 feet tall. Lenny Young would later recall, "They were like smoke, they were black, they had no faces. I don't know if they had arms or heads. It was like they had no clothes on. They were walking towards us. They were around 5 feet, 6 inches to 6 feet tall." Patrick Morrison said, "They were weird looking, walking slow. They looked like they were wearing long skirts over their heads. They were black. They walked as if they were linked together, like figures in a chain gang." In fact, the Center for UFO Studies in Evanston, Illinois, would add that the case is one of the most 3 credible encounters before the 1977 hit film, Steven Spielberg's Close Encounter of the Third Kind. Richard Haynes, a psychologist, noted he was impressed by the very similar detail in the different stories told by the three 14-year-old boys. He did add in his report, though, that there was no other eyewitnesses that saw the event. That said, what can we make of this story? In general, there are three primary theories about what happened that night. The first is that the boys were victims of an elaborate hoax. Most believe, based on the interviews, that the boys' intentions were good and they weren't lying, but some suggest they might have been tricked. While it's possible the individuals they spotted were just humans or in a costume, it doesn't really explain the lights in the sky or the UFO they saw. The second theory is that the boys spotted something extraterrestrial that night. This is the most popular theory and is supported by the consistent stories told by the boys. As mentioned, there were no other witnesses, but in a pretty remote area late at night, it's understandable that no one else saw it. The third theory was that the UFO and the beings were interdimensional in nature. This is one of the less popular theories, but some suggest that interdimensional beings are visiting us. Like all too often with these cases, the witnesses face trauma that can last for years. George Ferreira's mother reported he had nightmares about the event for years. It's quite understandable when you think about what might have happened if the boys had felt brave and approached the entities. Would they have been taken? It surely seems possible. In sum, the West Pittsburgh case is surely an interesting one, and one that appears quite credible. In this episode, we will dive into three strange alien encounters. In 1978, a highly credible close encounter of the third kind would occur in Rimini, Italy. A 36-year-old Italian man named Antonio would come face to face with something unexplainable. Around 11:30 p.m., Antonio was watching TV, waiting for a boxing fight to come on. Before diving into the encounter, it's important to know some basics on Antonio's background. Antonio was very outspoken in his political views and as such had been the target of many threats. He worked as a security guard, and being very unpopular with many, he feared retaliation from his opponents. At night, it was foggy with a light drizzle, and just before midnight, Antonio's dog, which was a Marama sheepdog, began barking furiously at the window. Antonio knew his dog well, and that type of bark indicated it was a person, not another animal. Due to this, Antonio was convinced a thief or vandal was outside. Antonio decided to head to the window and look out. As he glanced out, he spotted a strange light around 100 feet away. The main center part was orange, but other parts were different colors, such as purple. Antonio knew pretty quickly what it was, or what he believed it was. He turned around and screamed to his relatives to come quickly. His wife, her mother, and his sister came out and witnessed the light for just a few moments, when it would then completely disappear. He began walking back to watch the TV, thinking the excitement was over, when once again he would hear his dog begin to bark angrily. This time, nervously, Antonio decided to walk outside and investigate what was happening. Outside, he stared toward the gate and shined his flashlight toward the darkness. Then, he heard noises in the tall grass and immediately shined his flashlight in the direction of the noise. There, about 20 feet away, Antonio would be stunned to see something. Two gray aliens staring at him. Both were slim, with large jet black eyes, and had on a dark gray, tight-fitted suit. One of the humanoids was taller than the other one, being around 4.5 feet, while the other was around 3.5. They wore belts that had a distinctive, bright silver buckle. For a few seconds, the Greys stared at Antonio, and Antonio stared back. Both parties were very surprised, and it seemed like Antonio had caught the Greys off guard. Antonio then shouted to his family to come over. Once he turned back around, the Greys had disappeared into the tall grass. The next day, after a sleepless night, Antonio went out to the spot he had seen the greys. He realized quickly that the greys were actually around the same size. At the spot, he saw that one of them was standing on a small hill, while the other was not. In the area, Antonio would spot a 4-foot circular burn mark in the grass. It's generally believed this burn mark was from a light beam where the greys were transported down toward the ground from the ship, and eventually they returned back up through it. It be said Antonio had seen depictions of greys before. He had seen a painting of these entities from the woman painter Modigliani. Also, on television, he had seen The Little Man of Roswell, which featured gray aliens. What can we make of Antonio's case? It seems somewhat credible, although like so many cases, it really comes down to eyewitness credibility. We've seen many report UFOs and other close encounters, but unfortunately, all too often, when these individuals are alone, it doesn't make for a compelling case. That said, we shouldn't dismiss Antonio's case, as he not only saw the beings, but also saw the lights too. A better question might be, what were these greys doing? It's generally believed these entities were collecting samples, as they appeared to be caught off guard. It could be the case as well. They were abducting animals, as we have seen reports of animals on crafts. In the report, a positive aspect we need to point out is that Antonio would report feeling no fear when he saw the beings. On July 2nd, 1953, a strange alien encounter would happen in the municipality of Villas del Sals in Spain. Around 10 a.m. on his farm, 14-year-old Maximo Muñoz Hernais walked out of his home and toward the cattle. His chore that morning was simple: ensure that the livestock didn't wander off into the crops. Maximo sat down, and for the next 3 hours, he watched the cattle. Then around 1 p.m. local time, Maximo would suddenly hear a strange, faint, intermittent whistling sound. Initially, he didn't think much of it, as the sound was barely audible, but in a few minutes, Maximo decided to turn around and see what was producing the noise. As he turned around, he spotted what he believed to be a balloon. Each year, the local fair had balloons similar to what he saw, so his initial thoughts were that it must have been that. However, upon closer inspection, it seemed like this was something different. Maximo got up and started walking toward the object. It was around 3.5 feet in height, oval-shaped, and looked like a water container. It was a bright silver color, and where the sun reflected off it, it shined bright yellow. Maximo got closer and closer and finally was getting ready to reach out and grab it when he heard something. The top opened up. Maximo took a few steps back, and a stunned Maximo watched as 3 tiny humanoids jumped onto the ground. The beings were surely strange looking and didn't look like a typical alien. They were around 2 feet tall, had yellow faces with eyes that looked East Asian. They wore flat hats with visors in the front. Like we see in other cases, the beings, or chaps as Maximo called them, wore one-piece blue suits and also had some sort of emblem on the sleeve. Unfortunately, Maximo didn't make out exactly what the emblem was. The beings walked over and stood around him. The entity in the front of Maximo began trying to communicate with him. However, Maximo couldn't understand what he was saying. As the entity realized Maximo couldn't understand it, this seemed frustrated, and in a shocking turn of events, the entity gently slapped Maximo in the face. For the next few minutes, the beings stood around Maximo, and realizing they couldn't communicate with him, walked back toward the ship and got in. The craft then ascended and took off quickly into the sky. There was no smoke trail. After this, Maximo ran home and told his dad what happened. His father was skeptical, but could see Maximo was frightened, and the two headed out along with a police officer to where the incident had occurred. There, they found imprints of the craft in the beings. There were footprints in 4 holes about 5 centimeters deep and 2.5 centimeters across, each separated about 36 centimeters from each other. While the evidence wasn't overwhelming, it certainly lends support to Maximo's story. It's important to point out that around the time Maximo spotted the craft at the nearby Onrubia police post, several police officers would see a gray, white circular object traveling quickly to the east and leaving no smoke behind. The officers would state when they first spotted the object, it came from the direction of Villas del Sals, the municipality where Maximo's encounter occurred. What can we make of this case? In our opinion, the story seems pretty credible, although it did happen long ago, and it's not clear how thoroughly the event was investigated. However, Maximo's encounter provides support for the theory that mankind is being visited by more than one species of alien. In fact, many believe there are hundreds or possibly thousands that visit our planet. Interestingly, the 2-foot-tall beings do resemble another close encounter we covered on this channel. In 1971, in Finland, a logger would encounter tiny beings which they described as around 2 feet tall and wearing a one-piece, green-covered suit. The beings had a green helmet with some sort of black visor obscuring its face. It didn't have any hands and had green boots as well. There are obviously differences between the two, but is it possible these two alien species are related? After the initial reports and investigation into Maximo's case, Maximo would never talk about the matter again. It's not clear why, but our guess is that, like so many others, he was ridiculed and wanted to move on with his life. On December 2nd, 1964, Wisconsin farmer William Bosak was returning from a farmers' co-op meeting when he would have an experience he would never forget. Around 10:30 p.m., Bosak was around a mile from his home when his headlights reflected off something strange up to the left. The night was cold and foggy, and Bosak was already driving slow due to the fog. As he slowed down even more, he would be stunned to see something he had never seen before. An oval-shaped silver craft hovered around 8 to 10 feet in height. There was a bullet-shaped window right in the middle, with something moving around. The craft was dark and only lit up by the headlights. For a moment's time, Bosak was able to see the creature through the window. The being resembled a humanoid, but clearly wasn't. It had hair sticking out from the side and ears that looked floppy, like a cow's. The entity had huge eyes, wore a brown, tight-fitted outfit, and stared directly at Bosak, appearing to be scared as well. Still going slow at the time, a stunned Bosak suddenly became frightened and put the pedal to the metal. However, something truly strange happened next. The inside of his car went fully dark, and there was some sort of odd sound that resembled tree branches hitting the car. It's not exactly clear what happened, but a few moments later, it stopped. Was Bosak and his vehicle taken? Did the UFO attempt to shut down his vehicle and fail? It's not really clear. Regardless, a confused and scared Bosak continued speeding away and moments later arrived at his house, situated on a 400-acre dairy farm. He jumped out and quickly hurried into his home, running upstairs and trying to see if he could spot the craft. Unfortunately, he couldn't see it due to the fog, but it's possible too that it had already left. The next day, William Bosak would go to the spot and walk around the area looking for clues. No evidence was found though. Eventually, William Bosak's story would hit the press and be picked up by the Aerial Phenomenon Research Organization, or the APRO. The APRO would send out investigators and find William Bosak to be very credible and sincere. What can we make of this strange, albeit close encounter of the third kind? The being description was surely strange, and it's possible that even William's description wasn't entirely accurate. However, even though there was no other witnesses or corroborating evidence, it seems that William did see something in the sky that night, and it did not want to be seen. In 1989, a Russian man would have a strange alien encounter at Kopanskoye Lake in Russia. The man, named Alexander Viktorovich, was on a fishing trip with two friends when the event would occur. This case has many features and characteristics we see in other close encounters of the third kind, and interestingly, features a massive Sasquatch-like creature. Many have speculated Bigfoot is an extraterrestrial. In this case, provides further support for that theory. In this episode, we will explore this little-known close encounter of the third kind, an event known as the 1989 Kopanskoye Lake alien encounter. On February 13th, 1989, 3 Russian men would head out to Kopanskoye Lake for a fishing trip. Strange events would begin almost initially when the 3 men were fishing and would spot a UFO in the sky. The object appeared as a bright white light. As the men watched it, it came closer and closer, growing brighter and brighter until it finally stopped and shot off quickly to the east. Although interested by it, the men kept fishing, and with the sun beginning to set, they decided to pack it in for the day and set up camp. To get a fire going, Alexander headed off into the woods to get firewood. As Alexander walked the shoreline collecting wood, it quickly became dark. As he looked back in the forest, he would be shocked to see something he would never forget. About 20 feet back in the brush, Alexander would spot a silver-shaped UFO, presumably the craft they saw earlier in the day. The craft was round with windows around the midsection. It was a dark grayish color with light coming from the windows. As with many other reports, the object was reported to be extremely smooth. Alexander would also note the ship didn't have any visible doors or hatches on it, albeit they could have been on the other side. Then, Alexander would notice a being walking toward the back left of the object. In addition, he would spot 2 other humanoids, one on the right side and another in the middle of the two. Alexander contemplated yelling for his friends, but didn't want to cause a commotion. Interestingly, Alexander wasn't scared at the time. In fact, he alleges he even thought of trying to take one of the beings and put it in the trunk of his car. The beings moved around completely in silence, which probably explained why they didn't hear them earlier. After debating what to do, Alexander finally decided to yell out to the beings in a friendly manner. They immediately noticed and began walking toward him. 2 of the beings would walk right up, with the third just behind them. As they got closer, Alexander could make out more details. The aliens wore tight-fitting, gray-colored outfits, and for the most part appeared human. However, there were definitely differences. They had no hair and barely any lips. They also had a look of severe concentration in their eyes, which was very unnatural. Then a white flash similar to flash photography went off. Alexander then felt immense pressure on his head and heard a voice state in his mind, "What are you doing here?" He stated that he was out fishing with friends. The voice then said, "Would you like to come with us?" He didn't answer and thought about it when the voice would then say, "You will not return. We need to know what your inner structure is." Alexander shook his head. What happened next would be something we see all too often in these close encounters of the third kind. The voice stated in a very threatening manner, "If you start a nuclear war, we will destroy you." Like so many cases we have covered on this channel, the beings took a keen interest in nuclear weapons and preventing humans from using them. In addition, it should be pointed out that this event occurred 40 kilometers from the town of Sosnovyy Bor, where a nuclear plant was located. What happened next would truly astonish Alexander. Just behind the trees, he would spot a massive ape-like creature come barreling through. The Goliath figure was around 12 feet tall and towered over everyone. The creature seemingly communicated with the beings, and after a minute or two, all 4 walked back toward the craft. During this time, a stunned Alexander watched in amazement. Then a minute or so later, he would see the craft rise into the air slowly, a bright white light flashed and the UFO was gone. What can we make of this obscure Russian case? In general, it seems pretty credible for several reasons. First, the experience and report is very typical from what many say. The beings communicated using telepathy, something we see many times. In addition, their appearance is something we have seen in other cases too. They appeared humanoid and human-looking, but not like Nordic or tall whites, and wore tight-fitted, gray outfits. The one thing that surely stands out too is the lecture around nuclear weapons. This happens time and time again, and often is pretty confusing why these entities lecture average people around nuclear weapons. Many point out these individuals have no control over the events and raise the question, why don't the beings approach world leaders? These are legitimate questions, and our best guess is that despite being very advanced technology, they don't fully grasp human society and how it functions. In looking down from the stars, for example, it might appear everyone in the United States has the same level of influence, but we know that's clearly not the case. This raises the question around nuclear weapons and the fears from the beings. It's widely speculated that when the first atomic bombs went off in the 1940s, that sent shockwaves and was heard, for lack of a better term, around the universe. While these beings were visiting us before then, some believe the nuclear weapons caught the attention of these entities as they began to fear we might destroy our planet and make it uninhabitable. Some have speculated, though, the concern from these visitors over nuclear weapons is an interdimensional problem. As such, one hypothesis is that these weapons can open up some type of rip or portal to another world. Of course, this is all theories, and there's no evidence backing much of the interdimensional theories. One thing that stands out in this case is the Bigfoot sighting. It's theorized by some that Sasquatches are actually extraterrestrials. There's quite a number of cases where individuals on crafts have reported seeing Bigfoot-like creatures along with Greys and Nordics. One example of this is a case we covered on this channel named the Gateshead Grey. In this case, a boy reported seeing a Bigfoot-like alien with other ETs. In addition to abductees seeing Sasquatches on crafts, if they are ETs, it would help explain why they disappear so fast and why we've never found a corpse. Many Bigfoot researchers disagree with this hypothesis, though, and state that Sasquatches are of this earth and elusive because that's how they are. Coming back to the case, it's surely an interesting one, with many traits we see time and time again. Every so often, a case presents itself as so strange and unbelievable, it seems like it almost has to be true. In today's case, the witness tells an incredible story, one that isn't backed by evidence, but yet shares common characteristics with other alien encounters and UFO cases. The man alleges time distortion, as well as revelations from the beings regarding their whereabouts. In addition to this, the witness claims the beings communicated with him in an extremely odd manner. He would describe this as coded thoughts. In this episode, we will explore the multiple alien encounters of Pierre Monnet, as well as the messages he received from the beings. While Pierre alleged to have multiple contact with the beings, his first encounter happened in 1951 in the Vaucluse department of France. In July 1951, after spending the evening with his fiancée, then 19-year-old Pierre hopped on his bicycle and began cycling through the town to his home. As Pierre cycled through the town, he would pass the town clock. It was 1:30 a.m., and soon he planned to exit the city. However, then something happened. It's not clear what exactly occurred here, but the next thing Pierre remembers is he was bicycling, yet he was several miles further along and outside the city. It was as if he had been instantly transported. At this point, Pierre continued to bike down the gravel path and noted he felt compelled to go down it like some unknown force was pulling him. Pierre got off his bike and began walking at this point with his bike next to him. He even reported that he felt like he was floating, yet he wasn't sure this actually happened. As he approached a curve and walked around it, he would then see a light glowing about 200 feet ahead. Up ahead, Pierre spotted a craft. It was disc-shaped and hovering around 30 to 50 feet above the ground. The UFO was about 60 feet long, 10 feet high, and had a dome top. The craft was emitting a blue-white light and appeared to be silver beneath. Interestingly, he would note that the light seemed to move and didn't appear to be coming from any sort of light source, like a bulb. Still, Pierre would continue to walk toward the ship, and now a deafening silence was in the air. Needless to say, Pierre was in a state of shock, and soon things would become even more strange for him. Right below the ship, Pierre would spot 4 humanoid beings. They wore tight-fitted silver suits, and all the beings appeared pretty similar. They were all around 6 feet tall, with bare feet, well built, and had blonde hair to their shoulders. It appears here that Pierre encountered Nordic aliens or tall whites, but Pierre had a different opinion, at least initially, about the beings. Pierre thought the beings were robotic, not biological, since they were so similar. This is in contrast to many Nordic reports where witnesses believe the beings are biological in nature. Pierre walked up to the beings as they looked friendly. As he got close, the beings stood, and then all at the same time, they raised their right hand up with their palms up to shoulder length. This scared Pierre. However, as he started to retreat, the beings spoke to him telepathically. Oddly though, they didn't speak to him in French, but used what Pierre would describe as coded thoughts. Then after what Pierre would describe as being about 30 minutes, the coded thoughts stopped and Pierre would come out of his trance-like state. He looked up and saw the bottom part of the craft had opened up, although he didn't see or hear this happen. There was a white-orange light coming through, and the being suddenly disappeared, seemingly going into the craft. Things would only get more confusing for Pierre here, though. He looked at his watch, and it said 1:30, as if no time had passed at all. He was shocked and couldn't believe it, so he decided to bike back to the town clock because he thought maybe his watch had broke. When he arrived, he would be stunned to see that the time was 1:35 a.m. Pierre then headed home, and being still perplexed and worked up at what had happened that night, he thought maybe he was just in a strange dream. He decided to wake up his mother in the middle of the night just to make sure he remembered everything. When he woke up the next day and went to eat breakfast, his mother yelled at him for the late night wake up. At this point, Pierre knew the prior night wasn't a dream, but actually did happen. Over the following weeks, Pierre was able to conclude he had at least 20 minutes of missing time unaccounted for. However, the coded thoughts he received that night would start to become more clear for him. It actually took years for him to piece together the isolated messages, but when he did, it revealed much more about that night. One message was a warning to him not to walk any closer to the beings. Another message was they want the best thing for living beings, especially if they are not aggressive. The entities also informed Pierre he would suffer some short-term problems with his nervous system, and in time the message they intended to give him would become much clearer. Another coded thought was around contact with other humans. The beings stated that many people do not want to speak with them, and those that do are not believed. Probably the most important coded thought, though, was the beings informed Pierre they were going to experiment on him, doing him no harm, and that he wouldn't remember the event for some time. One of the tests was that they were going to regenerate his cells, which the being said would extend his life to around 120 years. Still, this wouldn't be the only encounter that Pierre had. Pierre would allege to see a craft when he was serving in the French military and was stationed overseas. In addition to this, he stated in June 1974 he drove to a gas station, and as he was filling up his car, he would spot two men who looked exactly like the men he saw in 1951. They looked over at him in unison, and soon they began sending coded messages once again to him. While Pierre spoke with several ufologists, an interview that happened in 1978 was incredibly bizarre. Pierre spoke with ufologist Timothy Good and would recall some unbelievable things. According to him, he would begin receiving telepathic communication from the beings again in 1977, and they revealed several things to him. One message was that the beings came from a star named Vega, which had 14 planets around it, 9 of which were inhabitable. Another message was that the beings had bases on Mars, our moon, and even planet Earth as well. Pierre would allege the beings were able to hide their bases from visible detection by using some sort of extremely powerful magnetic field. According to Pierre, the beings were able to use their technology to essentially be invisible. With such incredible claims and zero proof, what can we conclude from Pierre's case? Was this just a man who had seen too many science fiction movies? Or did these events actually happen to him? Skeptics will immediately point out that Pierre alleged to have a procedure done that would extend his life to 120, yet he died in 2009 at the age of 78 and seemingly of natural causes. In addition, there's not much to back up his fantastical claims. Could it be the case that Pierre did have these encounters, yet he completely mistranslated the messages? This surely seems possible, as many of the characteristics in his encounters are what we see all too often. For example, the craft was silver and disc-shaped with a dome on top. Also, the beings wore one-piece tight-fitted suits, another common trait reported in other cases. One of the more interesting aspects around this case was the coded messages. Why did they use coded messages and not just communicate clearly? Or did they wipe his mind, and was Pierre somehow able to regain information he wasn't supposed to know? While Pierre alleges that time seemed to be frozen, this is something that we've seen before. On a prior episode, we covered one case in 1977 where a Chilean soldier named Armando Valdez was on patrol when he and his team spotted a white bright light. Valdez went to investigate, and his team watched him vanish into thin air. After 15 minutes, he returned, seemingly from nowhere, and looked extremely rough. Valdez was clean-shaven earlier in the day, but now had a full beard. By all accounts, it seemed like he had been gone for 5 days, but according to the soldiers, he was only missing for 15 minutes. While many questioned whether Pierre was legit, he never wavered on his story. He also was quite adamant that government officials, as well as the military, were nervous about the crafts and didn't know what to do and had lied to citizens since day one. He would also state many humans have been contacted up to present day. While Pierre could have misinterpreted the communication and perhaps even lied about everything, he does seem to hit the nail on the head around UFO disclosure. Some of the best types of UFO cases involve sightings with many witnesses, while much more rare than UFO sightings with 1 or 2 witnesses. Reports with a large number are taken much more seriously, even by skeptics. In Japan, in the early 19th century, a strange ship washed ashore on the beach. The incident was seen by many, and perhaps more importantly, was documented in various Japanese writings. Since then, it has led many to research and ask, what was this craft? And perhaps more importantly, who was the strange woman inside it? In this episode, we will investigate this Japanese incident, a case that came to be known as Utsuro Bune, or the Hollow Ship Story. On February 22, 1803, several men were fishing just off the shores of Hariadoria Beach in the Hitachi region when they would spot a strange boat in the waves. The men noticed the ship wasn't big and decided to tow it back to shore. As they brought it back, people began to gather on the beach, wondering just what it was. Once it was ashore, they were able to observe the strange craft in more detail. It had a dome-like top that was colored dark red. The bottom was dome-shaped too, although more elongated, and was covered with something that resembled brass metal plates. The craft was around 11 feet tall and 18 feet wide, with windows covered by bars on the upper half. In general, it didn't look like anything that the fishermen nor anyone else had ever seen. What would happen next, though, would truly shock the onlookers. A young woman who appeared foreign and of European descent exited the craft. The woman was estimated to be around 5 feet tall. She had red hair and also had white hair extensions made of some type of fur. She appeared elegant and was wearing what appeared to be silk clothes. She also carried a box in front of her. The purpose of the box couldn't be ascertained by the Japanese citizens. All we know in regards to the box is that the woman was very protective over it and wouldn't let anyone touch it. The woman would begin speaking to the people. However, she wasn't speaking Japanese, and no one knew what she was trying to communicate. As a result, who she was and what she wanted was a complete mystery. As word reached the leader of the village, the town elder speculated that the woman might have been outcast from a foreign land because she had married against her father's will, or possibly she had cheated on her husband. At a crossroads, and not wanting to get drawn into a potential conflict if they helped her, the town elders decided to put her back in the ship and drag it out to sea. The strange boat was never seen again by the townspeople. Interestingly, this isn't the first time a case like this had happened in Japan during this time. Around the same time, sometime prior, there were reports of a strange ship similar in appearance washing up on a Japanese beach not too far away. In addition, a woman, similar to the one described, was on board the ship. Over the years, the story, and ones like it, have been examined by many due to the abundance of documents on the scene that day. In addition, there are other stories of hollow ships washing up around Japan during that time. Many of the details are very similar among the events. There's a number of documents that mention this story. In fact, several Japanese newspapers from the early 19th century tell very similar stories. These include Tales from the Rabbit Garden, published in 1825, Stories from Drifters, around 1835, and Dust of the Plume, from 1844. It's important to point out, too, that these are just several of the more well-known sources, as others exist too. This incident has been explored and has raised questions around what exactly the ship was and who was the woman. We know several things. This event seemed very likely to occur, as multiple sources have documented around Japan. In addition, we pretty much know this woman wasn't from Japan based on her description, and also the ship didn't appear to be Japanese. That said, there are traditional Japanese boats known as Utsuro Bune, which are circular, open log boats, but these are quite different than the descriptions of the hollow ship. Generally, there appears to be two main theories on who this woman was and what the ship was. The first is that the woman and ship were from some type of European country or other Western country. The description of the woman supports this theory. However, most of the facts around it don't make sense. If a woman was banished, it seems almost certain she would have died at sea, unless of course she was dropped off near the Sea of Japan. Also, by all accounts, the woman looked healthy. Was she dropped off with the intent to allow the Japanese to imprison her? Possibly, but this seems unlikely. This has led many to speculate and support the second theory. This is that the woman was an extraterrestrial and the craft somehow malfunctioned. It was reported there was strange writing inside it, and even though Japanese citizens wouldn't recognize English letters, it's a bit odd that there would be writing inside the craft. Some speculate that this was some sort of survival pod. It does bear a remarkable resemblance to the pods used by NASA astronauts when they return to Earth. Perhaps a craft malfunctioned mid-flight and the being jumped in this escape pod. The being description itself seems to support this theory too. She was said to be wearing expensive clothes and didn't appear to be unhealthy or malnourished. The last question in this story concerns what was the box. One thought is that it could have been some sort of tracking device and that it would help her to be found. Unfortunately, this case has no remaining physical evidence nor witnesses that can be interviewed. We do, though, have a treasure trove of documents indicating something strange washed up on the shore that day. Perhaps in time, we will discover another document that reveals more about this strange event and who exactly this woman was and what her ship was as well. On April 18th, 1961, around 11 a.m., Wisconsin resident Joe Simonton was sitting down and eating a late breakfast when he would have one of the weirdest alien encounters in history. At the time, Simonton resided in the town of Eagle River and was working as a chicken farmer. As Joe was eating, he would suddenly hear a strange sound outside. It sounded like a jet being throttled back, and Joe would later describe it as sounding like knobby tires on wet pavement. Joe quickly headed outside and was stunned to see a UFO drop out of the sky. The craft was silver, 12 feet tall, and around 30 feet in diameter. Joe noted it was incredibly bright. He would later state it was brighter than chrome. On one edge of the craft, there were what appeared to be exhaust pipes around 6 inches in diameter. The craft continued descending and would land. Then nothing could prepare Joe for what happened next. A hatch would open on the side. He would spot 3 beings. He described them as having dark skin and looking Italian. They were around 5 feet in height and weighed around 125 pounds each. He aged the being as somewhere between 25 to 30 years old. The beings wore dark blue uniforms and had turtleneck collars. They also wore helmets and were clean shaven. The visitors would next communicate with Joe through telepathy. They had a silver-shaped jug that was around 12 inches tall and had 2 handles. Joe stated the jug seemed to be made of the same material as the craft. The beings would communicate to Joe that they needed or wanted water. They handed the jug to him, and Joe would state the jug was absolutely beautiful. The strange metal-like material weighed less than steel, but more than aluminum. Joe left the beings and headed down to the water pump he had in his basement. After filling up the jug, he went back up, still in awe of it. As he got to the craft, Joe had to lean against it to hand it back, and he would get a better look as to what was happening inside the craft. In it, it was black, and there appeared to be 3 multicolored instrument panels for driving the ship. Most oddly, though, he noticed that one of the beings appeared to be grilling something that resembled pancakes. One of the beings would notice Joe seeing the pancakes and grab 3 for him. The pancakes were small, about 3 inches in diameter, and perforated with small holes. After the being, who Joe thought was the leader, handed him the pancakes, he touched his forehead, and what Joe would later interpret was the being's way of showing gratitude. The leader then closed the craft. It would rise up about 20 feet and then instantaneously shot off to the south. It was such a powerful blast of air that it bent the tops of the pine trees in the nearby area. Next, Joe would try one of the pancakes. He would later state it tasted like cardboard. The other 2 pancakes he gave to Judge Frank Carter. Carter would send the pancakes off to be tested. He sent them to the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomenon, or NICAP. NICAP, though, refused to test them. This upset Carter, who wanted to give a lecture on the experience. Carter was said to be an avid UFO enthusiast. Despite NICAP not wanting to get involved, the case drew the attention of J. Allen Hynek. During this time, Hynek was an astronomer at Northwestern University. After studying many cases and investigating them, he became convinced that UFOs are real. This would lead him to find his own group to study them. The group would even take over NICAP's files after they went under. Hynek would investigate many cases, such as the Red Bluff UFO incident and also the Lonnie Zamora case, both of which we covered on this channel. Most notably though, he created the Hynek classification system, which is still in effect today. This is the Close Encounters scale. Hynek would push to get the strange pancakes tested. A group of scientists from Northwestern and the Air Force's Technical Intelligence Center analyzed them. The group would discover them to be made of elements of this planet. More specifically, the pancakes were made of flour, sugar, and grease. The Air Force would investigate the other aspects of the case and conclude the following. Simonton answered questions directly, did not contradict himself, insisted on the facts being exactly as he stated, and refused to accept embellishments or modifications. He stated he was sure that we wouldn't believe him, but he didn't care whether he was believed. He stated simply that this happened, and that was that. Interestingly, the report also stated the only flaw is the disappearance of the craft in 2 seconds. This is really odd for a number of reasons, most notably because in so many cases witnesses report seeing craft flying off at incredible speeds. Sometimes they fly so fast that some witnesses report the craft disappearing into thin air. Other Air Force personnel would investigate Joe as well. Some believed him, while others thought he may have hallucinated the event due to an injury. One interesting theory comes from Lloyd Mallon, who wrote a book titled The UFO Handbook for Air Force Personnel. Mallon stated the Air Force investigated one popular rumor that swirled in the community that was published by Raymond Palmer, the publisher of Pulp Flying Saucer and several other science fiction magazines. Palmer wrote that Joe was hypnotized by someone who was hired by a local real estate agent and given the pancake story. This was done so he would repeat it and be able to bypass any sort of lie detector. The hope from the real estate agent, according to the rumor, was that it would draw attention to the area and boost business. Still, most look past Palmer's theory due to the reputation of Palmer. Palmer was considered somewhat of a nut job even in UFO circles. For example, one of Palmer's beliefs was that UFOs came from a secret Hollow Earth civilization ruled by a race called detrimental robots, which he called Deros. Palmer believed the Deros manipulated humanity with some sort of rays he called thought rays. Palmer was said to have only one source for his theory, and it came from the memory of a Pennsylvania welder. While there weren't any other witnesses that saw what Joe saw, one interesting account comes from someone in the area. About the same time Joe was visited, a local insurance agent named Savino Borgo was driving along Highway 70 about a mile from Joe's farm. According to Borgo, he saw what he later described as a flying saucer rising diagonally into the air and flying parallel with the highway. What can we make of the Joe Simonton case? By all accounts, Joe appeared to be very credible and also told the story in a consistent manner. He was interrogated by not only military officials, but also local police, many who knew Joe for decades and said they believed him and that he was also very reliable. The story of Joe Simonton is surely an interesting one for a number of reasons. First and foremost are the pancakes he was given. While they appear to be of terrestrial origin and made from ordinary ingredients, that's not definite proof that this encounter didn't happen. Joe kept the pancakes, and if he did try and fabricate the encounter, why would he send them off so they could be tested? The pancakes seem to support the theory these beings were biological in nature just like us, needing energy. This leads to the next strange aspect of this case, the water jug. Why would the beings need such a small amount of water, and couldn't they get this water themselves? As many have joked on the case, maybe the pancake batter was too thick. Cases where beings need water, though, are not unheard of. On this channel, we covered a close encounter of the third kind, called the Udo-Wartina case. In that case, the witness reported the craft landed next to a river, and several hoses came out of the ship, sucking up the water. It's not clear why they needed the water, though. One other intriguing aspect of this case is the beings. Usually when people report encounters with aliens that are human-like, they're Nordics. Nordics have blonde hair, blue eyes, are tall, and are known for being physically attractive. These beings, though, Joe described as Italian-looking. This is not something seen that often. The encounter itself seemed to be amicable, although some have stated they believe the pancake was actually some sort of scientific experiment. Did it contain some sort of ingredients that were put in Joe's system to track him? Many don't think so, as they believe they wouldn't actually need to do this. While the most popular theory is that this was ETs, some have suggested this was a military experiment. The beings appeared human, but not Nordics. Also, the pancake ingredients were of this planet. Perhaps the military was testing something with the pancake. In general, this case surely is an odd one, but one that surely deserves attention. Unfortunately, there was only one witness to the event, although he sure seems credible. It said Joe had more encounters after this, which isn't that unusual. Unfortunately, the attention and constant harassment from his story seemed to deter him from reporting more encounters. On Sunday, October 28, 1973, a young truck driver would show up in a hospital in Bahia Blanca, Argentina, in a complete state of amnesia. The man did not know his name, where he lived, any family, and had no personal, identifiable information on him. The confused hospital staff examined the man to see if he had any head injuries, but other than a bad headache, there was nothing evident. The man was found wandering aimlessly around asking for help, and soon a good Samaritan would take him to the hospital. In several days, the man's memory would come back, and soon he would realize he had an encounter with something strange that night. In this episode, we will explore the alien encounter of Dionisa Llanca. On the evening of Saturday, October 27th, 1973, around 6 p.m., Argentinian truck driver Dionisa Llanca woke up from sleeping and began getting ready. Llanca lived in a small cottage by himself in Calle Chubat, which was around 10 minutes from Bahia Blanca. Since he would be driving all night, he ate dinner around 10 p.m. and then around 12:30 p.m. headed out the door to drive toward Rio Gallegos, which was around a 2-day trip. Llanca was used to driving all night, and on this trip, he would be hauling construction materials. Right before leaving, Llanca would see his right rear tire was low on air. He considered changing it, but thought it could make the trip. This decision would change his life forever. Shortly into his drive, Llanca would notice the tire was much worse than he thought. He had no choice but to pull over and change the tire. At 1:15 a.m., on the dark, deserted road, Llanca began pulling down his tools and began to change the tire. It was cold and extremely dark, and Llanca was upset he didn't stop and change it at one of the gas stations he had passed. Then behind the truck, a bright yellow light would suddenly light up the entire road. Llanca was busy trying to fix the tire, so he didn't realize the extent of the light at first. He thought it was just another truck with its high beams on. However, the brightness intensified, and Llanca soon realized this was something else. The light then changed to blue. Llanca tried to get up, but couldn't. His legs were paralyzed. He was on his knees, but was able to turn his head. As he did, he would spot a strange oval-shaped craft hovering. Even more shocking, though, To the right of his shoulder behind him, 3 humanoid beings stood. The beings were around 5 feet tall, with blonde hair, and had tight-fitted silver coveralls. They sported yellow boots and had long black gloves. They had no belts or helmets. There were 2 men and 1 woman. The beings looked human, except their eyes. They were more slanted than ours. Llanca would also note they had large foreheads as well. The beings would stand and talk among themselves in a strange language. It sounded like a strange chirping sound. Still paralyzed at the time, Llanca was unable to get up. Things would get even worse for him, though. He soon realized he was unable to speak or move his face. Then nothing could prepare Llanca for what happened next. One of the beings grabbed him by his collar and easily lifted him into the air. Llanca tried to talk and communicate, but still wasn't able to. As he was suspended in the air, one of the other beings stepped over, and it stuck some sort of device into his finger. Llanca would state this didn't hurt, but it did produce a little bit of blood. After this, he would pass out, and this is where the mystery begins. Sometime between 2 to 3 a.m. on the same night, Llanca would wake up in a rail yard. This spot was around 6 kilometers from where Llanca's truck had broken down, and his truck was still there. Llanca began walking toward the lights and would soon come upon a road. He would appear to wander for some time and eventually end up in the city. The man who dropped him off stated Llanca was mumbling and described him as being catatonic or like a robot. That morning, Dr. Ricardo Smirnoff, a forensic surgeon, would examine Llanca and recalled the strange incident. Smirnoff would state, "I am a forensic surgeon. I had rotating duty on Sunday the 28th. About 9:30, Dr. Alpotero at the Spanish hospital called me and said that he had a curious case. I arrived at the hospital around 10:15 and saw a young man of about 25 or 26 years of age in a total state of amnesia. He could remember nothing of his past. He did not know who he was, where he was born, who his parents were, or anything about his past. He cried continually and asked what town he was in. The doctor told me that a man had left him at the hospital after encountering him wandering in the center of the city like a robot and asking everyone he met where a police box was. At first he thought he had an automobile accident on the road. He changed this as he had no injuries. When I touched his head or came near his hand, he drew back instinctively as though it would produce pain. He had a bad headache in the right parietal temporal area. I notified the police and had him admitted to the municipal hospital. In the days that followed, Llanca's memory would come back, or most of his memories. He was able to recall the encounter with the beings and regained his memories around his personal life. Still, it's not known what happened after he blacked out and got to the rail yard. The distance was over 6 kilometers, so this raises the question, did he walk there, or was he put there by the beings? Mathematically, it's possible he walked there, even in his catatonic state, as a person could do this walk in 1 hour and 15 minutes, or possibly even quicker. If you recall, he encountered the beings at 1:15 a.m. and was in the rail yard sometime between 2 to 3. That said, we should point out, being in a catatonic and paranoid state like he was, this probably would have slowed his walking speed. That said, it's surely possible that he did walk the walk by himself, and there was no abduction, but it's not known. As for the encounter, this case appears to have many credible aspects. First, the beings approached the man on the highway, and it involved a bright bluish light. This is a scene we see all too often, and crafts approaching people on desolate roads we see time and time again. Also, the beings appear to be Nordic aliens. All 3 are reported as having blonde hair and large foreheads, as well as tight-fitted silver suits. Those are characteristics many report when seeing these beings. One interesting aspect of this case is the chirping sound. Not too long ago, on a case we covered on this channel, the 1967 Rimini, Idaho alien encounter, 2 young men would report this strange characteristic. While driving on a desolate highway, they would encounter strange beings who communicated through chirping. It's a strange coincidence, although the beings in this case did not appear to be Nordics, as they appeared to have wrinkly skin. That said, perhaps these 2 different species share a common communication manner. It's said that Llanca is a simple man with no interest in UFOs. In the days he was interviewed by ufologists, he was said to be extremely somber and did not smile once. Hospital staff characterized him as traumatized and innocent. Of course, skeptics will argue these symptoms are easy to fake, and he may have done this for the attention. Still, by all accounts, this was the only close encounter of the third kind that Llanca had, and he was able to move on from his experience. In 1994, a British man named Paul Sinclair purchased a 6-bedroom Victorian home in Bridlington, England. Paul was married with 4 daughters, and the family was thrilled about the prospect of living there. The home needed a lot of work, but once finished, it would be worth it. Prior to moving in, though, something happened, something terrifying and truly bizarre. This case features both extraterrestrial and supernatural elements, something we see from time to time. In this episode, we will examine this Paul Sinclair alien encounter, entities that Paul would later name the Night People. In the spring of 1994, after purchasing a fantastic home for his family, Paul Sinclair began to get to work on the property, commuting from his current home in Doncaster. The house needed quite a bit of work, as it had been empty for 2 years. All the utilities were off, and the prior owners, an elderly couple, had passed away. They had left all their belongings there. As such, Paul had much cleaning to do, and one weekend he decided to bring his oldest daughter Sarah with him. This weekend would forever change their lives. As Paul and Sarah reached the property, they would separate, with Sarah cleaning the upstairs and Paul the downstairs. Strange activity would happen pretty soon after they arrived. It began with Sarah. Sarah was upstairs clearing out a room when she would hear a voice say something to her. The terrified teenager would sprint down the stairs, screaming to her dad. Paul headed up and went into the bedroom confused. He looked around and really didn't know what to make of it. He proposed that maybe Sarah had heard voices from outside, or perhaps she had imagined it altogether. Sarah was adamant, though, it wasn't from outside, nor did she imagine it. Paul agreed to stay upstairs with her, and they would both clear out the room together. They got back to work, and just a few moments later, they heard one of the heavy wooden doors slam shut. The two immediately looked at one another. Just a second later, another wooden door slammed closed. The two once again looked at each other, shocked. After a few seconds, Paul hesitantly suggested it was the wind, while Sarah reluctantly agreed. The two knew something seemed to be happening, but despite this, had to get back to work. The rest of the afternoon, they continued to pack up the upstairs. As night was coming, the two discussed driving home for the night. After all, it was only about an hour-and-a-half drive. However, Paul knew they had a lot to do and thought it would be best to spend the night and get an early start tomorrow. After all, they had planned to spend the night in the first place. The two had brought cushions, clean sheets, and blankets so that they could have a temporary bed. They would be sleeping in the same room where Sarah had heard the whispers. Paul felt anxious about sleeping there after what had occurred, but he reasoned this was going to be their dream home, and they would be sleeping there soon enough anyway. Around 10 p.m., Paul decided to turn out the lights they had brought in the room. To have some light, though, he turned on their portable television and turned down the volume. Soon, both fell asleep after a hard day's work. Around 3 a.m., Paul woke up. Immediately, he felt something was wrong or off. He wasn't sure what it was, but got a sense that something was watching him. A terrified Paul began to look around the room. He couldn't see anything, but had a strange feeling there was something in the corner. One of the corners of the room was extremely dark, and Paul shifted his eyes into the corner and began to stare. After just a few moments, a trembling Paul began to make out a shape of some type of humanoid. He kept staring, and the longer he did, the more he could see. It was some type of being, completely pitch dark. The entity was very thin and wearing a big coat. The being was wearing a large hat, one that looked way too big for its skinny frame. Many speculate that Paul spotted a shadow person, or in this case, an entity known as the Hat Man. We will discuss this more in the video, as Paul's terrifying night was just getting started. Next, Paul glanced out in the hallway and would notice the spindles on the staircase were glowing white. He thought initially maybe Sarah had painted them, but soon realized she definitely had not. He would watch as they grew brighter and brighter. He realized the light was coming up the stairs. Paul turned to the side and saw Sarah was asleep, and as he glanced back, both the stairs and hallway were lit, and Paul would see something he would never forget. 3 glowing white beings were there. They hovered from the hallway into the bedroom, and Paul watched as the entire room turned bright white. Then something happened, and Paul's next memory was waking up in the bed. For whatever reason, Paul temporarily forgot about the incident from the prior night. Him and Sarah got working on the home so they could return home later. Sometime during the day, Paul would glance down at his arm and see small dots on it. He touched them and they didn't hurt, but he couldn't figure out exactly what they were. There were 13 total. Then, like a person suffering from amnesia, suddenly regaining their memories, Paul remembered what happened the previous night. Paul recalled the strange shadow figure and the 3 glowing entities, who he later named the Night People. Perhaps even more frightening, he remembered this wasn't the first time he had encountered these beings. Paul was able to think back to his childhood and seeing the beings. He kept his thoughts to himself as he didn't want to scare Sarah, and the two finished up their work and headed home. Paul returned home, and in about a month, the strange dots disappeared from his arm. However, this wasn't the last encounter he would have. Paul would continue to have visits from the Night People for the next 20 years. Fearing ridicule, he did not discuss the events. The beings didn't seem to be harming him, but after some time, he decided to go public. It should be said that Paul also learned the beings could get to him anytime, any place, and there didn't seem to be any pattern involved. In 2015, Paul finally went public with the story. He was on a podcast with Whitley Strieber discussing his 2014 book, Truth Proof, The Truth That Leaves No Proof, and also promoting his newer book, set to release in 2016. In the podcast, there was no plan for him to go public, but Paul decided to do it out of the blue. Ufologist Whitley Strieber is certainly no stranger to strange experiences with extraterrestrials. Strieber is an alien abductee, author, and subject of the 1985 Hollywood movie Communion, starring Christopher Walken. Paul would write multiple books and is still actively investigating many unexplained phenomena, such as aliens, paranormal activity, and cryptids. He documents many of these in the stories in his books. Still, what can we make of Paul's encounter in 1994? There are several interesting aspects to it. First off, there appears to be multiple elements at play here, such as alien abduction, paranormal activity, and perhaps shadow people and the dreaded Hat Man. The Hat Man is said to be a black shadow humanoid that wears a trench coat and a fedora hat. Typically, it will stand in the corner and usually disappear into thin air. The being has no facial features and by accounts doesn't seem to always know it has been seen. Still, it's terrifying for all who see it, and according to Heidi Hollis, is pure evil. Hollis wrote a book on the subject, documenting at least 50 different stories of people seeing the Hat Man. She also wrote a book on shadow people, a similar type of entity, but one thought to be more benevolent. There's a lot more to say about the Hat Man and shadow people, and we will do so in a future episode. Coming back to the case, some think that this home was a magnet for strange activity, albeit this doesn't really explain why Paul has been stalked by these beings his entire life. In the house, there appears to be paranormal activity as Sarah heard voices and the door slammed by itself too. In addition to this, ET activity seems very likely, as Paul appears to have been taken. Still, once again, it seems he has been subjected to repeated alien abductions. Since he was young, he appears to have been visited by the night people, and to date, it doesn't seem like they have stopped. He had dots on his arm, with no explanations of how they got there. It's not unusual for alien encounters to be accompanied by other strange activities, such as people seeing ghosts and hearing strange things. It's not clear why this is, but what is clear is there are a number of cases involving both paranormal activity and also sightings of UFOs and aliens. The central question, though, is what causes what? Do the alien abductions and UFOs cause the veil between our world and others to become thinner, for lack of a better term? Is Paul's case credible? Like most cases, skeptics point out several flaws with Paul and his allegations. First off, many suggest that the marks on his arm could have just been bug bites. After all, he was sleeping in an old abandoned home, so bug bites certainly seem plausible. Others point out that Paul decided to come out and publicly discuss his experiences because he wanted to sell his 2016 book. Paul at the time was studying several unexplainable phenomena, so some suggest that he did have financial incentive. Still, others point out that his experiences have pushed him to try and understand his encounters. One question in Paul's case surrounds the night in question and why Sarah didn't wake up. Some believe that the beings might have been responsible for this. We see a good number of alien abduction cases where individual significant others are sound asleep while the abductee is taken. In sum, Paul's case seems pretty credible, and if you want to learn more, consider checking out one of his books or listening to his podcasts with Whitley Strieber. On November 10th, 1973, a Dutch woman would wake up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom. That night, she would peek out the window and see one of the strangest sights she would ever see. Several strange entities sweeping the road. Well, the case surely has the feeling of a vivid dream, or one person's imagination gone wild. Two other cases around this time would be incredibly similar to her story. In this episode, we will examine the alien encounter of Anne Delphin, an incident that would later be labeled as the Street Sweepers of Uden. Founded in the 12th century, Uden is a town located in the province of North Brabant in the Netherlands. The small town has a rich history and has grown from a small rural town with incredible dark cherries to an important economic center in the country. Still, in 1973, one of the oddest alien encounters in the history of the Netherlands would occur. At 2:15 in the morning, Anne woke up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom. Anne's bathroom was located on the far side of the home, and as such, Anne had to walk across the house to use it. She would pass by a set of windows on the front of the house, and out of the corner of her eye, Anne would spot something white out in the street. Being half asleep, she didn't think too much of it and used the restroom. After using the bathroom, Anne, who was now more awake, proceeded to walk back and once more saw the white. This time, though, she would stop. Anne looked out onto the street and spotted 3 figures wearing white robes. They were around 3 feet tall and appeared to be using some sort of device to sweep the street. Anne could see the beings' feet, which were pretty big for their size. What was probably most strange, though, was the beings were walking in the same direction, but they weren't picking up their feet as they moved. It's like they were rolling slowly, or appeared to be waddling. The beings wore a white hood, which obscured their face, and wasn't tall or pointy, but the hood split off into 2 points that hung down from the back on either side, similar to a jester's hat. The beings continued to shuffle down the road, and Anne continued to watch them. The beings had a belt that had some different tools on it. It was a full moon that night, and Anne could make out the devices as they reflected off the moonlight. Still, the most odd detail of this case probably has to do with the devices that they held out in front. The beings all appeared to be carrying an object that looked like a metal detector or a vacuum roller brush. The beings were rolling the device back and forth, and to the left and to the right. Anne would continue to watch the beings for around 5 minutes. During this time, she thought about waking up her husband, but her spouse had been having heart problems, and she decided that it might be too much for him. After around 5 minutes, one of the beings would turn around and look directly at Anne. Anne couldn't see its face, but she had been made. The being turned around and communicated to the other something. A few moments later, the 3 humanoids quickly waddled away and disappeared behind a school. Anne, who was in shock, would continue to watch the street for several minutes, believing they might come back. After they didn't, Anne would decide to head back to bed. As she came in the bedroom, her husband appeared to be groggy and waking up. She was getting ready to tell him what she saw when she would look out the window and see a red light. Anne estimated the red ball of light to be about 130 feet away and around 7 feet across. She looked at it, but it was so bright after a few seconds she had to look away. She then looked and said something to her half-asleep husband. She turned back around and the red ball of light was gone. She would proceed to tell him the story, and he would believe her, although he didn't see anything. Surprisingly, that night, Anne was able to fall back asleep. The next day, she would head to the police station and file a report. It's not clear if the police didn't believe her, or they just didn't care. But for an entire year, Anne wouldn't hear anything. After not hearing anything from the police, Anne decided to talk with her friend Bob Moyen about it. Bob would soon tell his son Edmund, who was a UFO enthusiast. Edmund would decide after hearing it that he should relay the story to the UFO community. As such, he wrote a letter to the Center of UFO Studies. In the organization, ufologists David Webb and Ted Blocher would take an interest in the case. Both men contributed significantly to the field of ufology. Ted Blocher, who was also an actor and singer, compiled the results of a historical study that documented all the reported UFO sightings during the 1947 flying disc craze. This study was released in 1967. Webb was an experienced UFO researcher and author as well. He would include Anne's story in his book, 1973, Year of the Humanoids, published in 1976. Still, the man probably most responsible for popularizing Anne's story was a Dutchman named William Bosak. Bosak spent a year working for the organization, and after some time would return back home in 1978 to the Netherlands. Bosak was very interested in Anne's case and would interview her several times. He would find Anne to be extremely credible and not one trying to seek fame or fortune. In fact, she had told very few the story in the past 5 years. While Anne did not seek the fame, it would soon come. Bosak would begin telling UFO organizations in the Netherlands, like Nobova, and soon the story hit the press. Once it started, the story spread like wildfire around the country. Anne did do several interviews, but did so under the pseudonym Saskia Vermeulen. The journalist came to the interview expecting to find a good laugh, but all of them walked out believing Anne and her story. While Anne's account seems extremely bizarre and weird, the fact is, it really isn't. In fact, the next month there would be 2 similar cases that occurred involving beings sweeping or using a metal detecting like device on the street. The first occurred in the same month as Anne's, in 1974 in November. This story comes from the 1975 book, The Process of Flying Saucers, which was written by Claude McDuff. In this case, 4 Canadian women were driving from Sorel-Tracy to Montreal for a night out on the town. As the women were heading into the city, they would spot an orb or ball of light over their heads. It would follow them for several miles over their car, and eventually a pink mist would come out of nowhere. Visibility was limited, and the women drove through the mist for what they perceived to be a matter of minutes. It's not clear if they experienced missing time, but what is clear is when they left the pink mist, a strange being was shuffling down the road with some sort of street sweeping device. In addition, the women would allege to see 3 men in black standing by a car on the side of the street. 1 month after Anne's encounter, another incident would occur. This occurred only 157 kilometers in the town of Villefort. This case we covered on this channel not too long ago. The story is as follows. On December 19th, 1973, a 28-year-old Belgian man awoke in the middle of the night to use the bathroom. After using it, he began walking back to his bedroom through the kitchen when suddenly he spotted a green glow coming through the curtains. The half-asleep man decided to peer through the window, and what he saw left him stunned. There was a 3-foot-tall humanoid walking around in his garden. The entity's outfit was different than what Anne described, as it was not wearing a robe. The outfit consisted of a one-piece tight-fitted suit that was emitting a greenish glow. It was wearing a transparent helmet, and a tube ran from the helmet to something on its back. Whatever was on its back was pretty big, covering the majority of it. However, just like Anne's case, the being appeared to be using some sort of metal detecting or sweeping device. As the man watched, the being placed 1 foot flat on a wall and began walking up it. The odd sight was truly unbelievable, as its gait stayed the same and the position of the metal detector device was the same as well. The being crested the wall, and soon a white light flashed beyond it. It seems that we have 2 cases with some similarities, and this is just from the same year. It should be pointed out too that Anne's case wasn't widely known at the time, so these don't seem to be copycat stories. Is this case, though, considered credible? As the case has become more popular over the years, so has the number of people who have examined it and scrutinized it. One individual that has studied the case has proposed an interesting theory that is worth looking at. In 1984, an amateur ufologist sent a letter to the Journal of Study Group for Foreign Air Phenomena proposing what he believed happened that night. The researcher's name was Mr. Moss, and his theory is quite popular with skeptics. Moss, who alleged to study the case extensively, stated that he used to live on a street similar to what Anne lived on. More specifically, the road was covered in stone and had been recently paved. Moss goes on to state that one night he was looking out his window when he would see several men exit their vehicle and begin using some sort of metal detecting device on the street. A curious Moss headed outside and asked what they were doing. One of the men informed him they were looking for gas leaks under the road. Why were they doing it at night? Less gas being used meant the pressure in the pipes was lower, and a gas leak could be detected easier. In addition, very little traffic at night as well. After Moss's letter, the story seemed like it had been solved. Or had it? Nobova, the UFO organization, took the theory seriously and even reached out to Obergas, the energy provider at the time. However, they didn't keep records that far back. Others weighed in as well. Bram Rosa, a UFO researcher, stated he didn't believe gas sweepers were widely used in 1973, and it wasn't done at night. While Moss's theory is an interesting one, it doesn't address several key questions. First, why were the individuals so short? Second, why would the gas sweepers be wearing robes? Also, how does he explain the red orb Anne saw? Why were they shuffling as if their feet had not lifted off the ground? It should be pointed out too, Anne watched them for around 5 minutes, and this just wasn't a quick glance. The second theory on this case is, of course, Anne saw some type of extraterrestrials, possibly collecting samples. In sum, it seems this is a credible case. Anne appeared to be a highly reputable witness by all who spoke with her, even the media. In addition, she even used an alias, which showed she wasn't in it for the fame. There are also at least 2 additional cases with entities using these sweeping devices for whatever reason. Thanks for watching, and please let us know your thoughts on this case, and if you know any cases involving these odd sweeping devices. In today's episode, we will cover several UFO sightings and alien encounters, from subscribers of the channel. The first story comes from a viewer who wished to remain anonymous, who has had multiple encounters with gray aliens and also has provided multiple photos of strange lights in the sky, as well as video footage of a UFO sighting. In addition to this, the viewer states his mother as well has had contact, something we see in a number of cases. The individual states that they have had many alien encounters and UFO sightings in their life. In one of the emails to me, he recalled one experience. One evening, after coming home from work, I was playing video games on my computer when one of them stood on my balcony, watching me through the window. I just stared back. I was thinking in a very limited way and felt no emotion at all in that moment. Only after he vanished did I realize what I had actually seen. From then on, the contact became more and more intense. I believe they have the ability to limit our consciousness and that they possess many advanced capabilities. For example, if they place their hand on my head, I lose consciousness almost instantly. Despite this, I'm fully convinced they are not hostile. I truly believe that many abductees or contactees like myself have parts of their memory and knowledge deliberately blocked, not out of cruelty, but to avoid interfering too heavily with our development of life, to prevent trauma, or to keep us from feeling too much fear. Interestingly, I had contact just yesterday. They told me they wanted to perform a few tests, which they did, and that they've been observing me for quite a while. However, they said they became particularly focused on me after discovering a 90% anomaly during one of their analysis last year, and that I belong to a rare group, about 10% of those they study. My blood type is A negative, which is also rare, but I don't know if that's related. What I've learned, they dislike loud noises, and they seem to have a form of artificial intelligence-based consciousness or thinking. My mother also had contact with them multiple times, but she's far more fearful and traumatized by it than I am. Perhaps she wasn't mentally ready. I believe many people still aren't. Sometimes I'm still afraid, and sometimes I'm completely calm. I guess that's very human. But overall, they don't seem like aggressive beings, and that gives me comfort. In several email exchanges, the viewer discussed his lifetime of experiences with the Greys, his beliefs, and other thoughts. The viewer believes the Greys hate loud sounds, and frighteningly, he references their dislike when he encounters them and screams. As many have stated before, the viewer stated his belief that a hybridization program is underway, and he or she seemed quite confident in this. In addition, he or she stated the beings were interested in studying the human soul, something we have seen in other cases. The viewer stated that he or she believes showing no fear is important when coming into contact with them. Interestingly, the viewer believes the Greys eat meat or like meat, albeit I didn't follow up as far as the reasoning behind this. One final experience from the viewer comes from a time when the individual was living in Germany. The viewer would go out and walk at night and typically follow the same route, going by a gas station. In the following video, he or she videotaped a light flying by at a high rate of speed. According to the witness, many saw the light that night. Here is the video. What can we make of the viewer's case? In general, the story shares many characteristics with other cases we have seen, such as other family members having encounters and also medical experiments. Unfortunately, it appears this story is still being written for this individual, so let's hope things get better for he or she. In our second and third story, a subscriber of the channel named Gaurav contacted us and highlighted 2 UFO sightings he experienced as a teenager, both share incredible features we see in other cases, albeit we have not covered many cases from India. The first story begins in the city of Calcutta in India in 2014 on Christmas Eve. Then, 14-year-old Gaurav, along with his father and his father's girlfriend, were driving home. That night, Gaurav's father and his girlfriend had been arguing about an event that they couldn't attend because of Christmas Eve. As they turned, they began heading through a section of the city called Newtown. At the time, Newtown was completely empty and under construction, with no businesses or residences. As such, it was completely empty of people and only lit up by the newly installed streetlights. Around 12 a.m., the argument had gone from bad to worse, and an uncomfortable Gaurav asked his dad to pull over, making up the excuse he wasn't feeling well. In reality, though, he just needed a break from the tension. As he walked out looking over the empty grass, Gaurav would see complete darkness straight ahead, along with several empty construction buildings off to the side. Gaurav hoped that stopping the car might allow the fight to simmer down, but as he glanced back, he could see it had only gotten worse. He then turned around and began looking up at the stars when something would grab his attention. Up in the sky, he would notice a triangular-shaped craft moving from his left toward his right in the night sky. Interestingly, the craft was using some sort of transparent camouflage to blend into the night sky. Gaurav would compare the camouflage to a magnifying glass as it seemed to enlarge or distort the stars behind it. The craft was completely silent and began to descend lower. At this time, it hovered right over him, around 50 feet above. The UFO was around the size of a bus, and he could see a red blinking light underneath it. At the time, Gaurav reported he felt no fear and was somewhat hypnotized by the object. After hovering just above him, the craft would then silently hover away from him. Gaurav would get back in the car and tell his dad what he just saw, but unfortunately, his already upset dad told him to stop acting childish. Just 2 years after Gaurav's first sighting, he would have a second. At the time, Gaurav had been having digestive problems and was told by his doctor to walk after eating to aid digestion. As such, in April 2016, Gaurav got up after eating dinner, put on some headphones and music, and walked up to his apartment building's rooftop for a late-night stroll. It was dark already, and the rooftop of his apartment building was quite big and empty at night, so it was a perfect place for a walk. On the rooftop, he would soon notice 2 yellow dots in the sky. He didn't think much of them at first, believing them to be stars, but that would soon change. He soon saw the 2 orbs were moving. The orbs began moving back and forth with one another in an odd pattern. Gaurav was stunned once again and couldn't believe what he was seeing. With the 2 orbs, one would disappear completely, while the other would slowly move east toward the west. Eventually, the craft moved directly above Gaurav, albeit it was very high in the sky. It's important to note here that Gaurav had left his phone in his apartment. Still, even if he had brought it with him, being so far away and at night, a picture wouldn't really be valuable in this sighting. The craft continued moving, and when it was a bit further away, another orb would fly in from the direction it was heading. The 2 orbs stopped right next to each other and circled around one another and eventually shot off in different directions. What can we make of Gaurav's stories? It appears more likely that he saw the same UFO or alien species on both occasions. There's been quite a few cases of UFOs camouflaging themselves in the sky. It seems on the first occasion it was doing this. On the second one, the crafts appeared high up in the sky, so perhaps they were aware they were being watched. To date, it doesn't appear that Gaurav has had any other sightings or experiences, but being quite young, in his mid-20s, it is possible he may have another one. There's been a number of cases we've covered on this channel where individuals who've seen a UFO or had a close encounter of the third kind have reported hearing a strange buzzing sound from the craft. It's a unique detail that we believe adds credibility to the case, and one we see time and time again, albeit in many cases crafts are reported to hover silently. In this episode, we will cover a little-known case from the 1950s that has several credible aspects to it. This close encounter of the third kind has come to be known as the 1954 Carpenter Encounter. In July 1954, around 5 a.m., Harold Carpenter was laying in bed half asleep when he would hear a strange buzzing sound. Carpenter resided in a rural area just outside Kent, England, and had heard the bizarre noise for several straight mornings. This time, though, Carpenter decided it was time to go see what the noise was. He got dressed and went outside, being very quiet as to not scare off whatever it was. As Carpenter stepped outside, he would hear the noise coming from the southwest, an area known as Sunny Calvert. He began walking in that direction and soon would begin heading down a hill in the thick brush. The noise continued to get louder and louder, and soon Carpenter was able to make out visual contact. Down the hill, Carpenter spotted the object and would describe it as mushroom-shaped without a bottom. The UFO was hovering around 10 feet above the ground, and it was gray with a diameter of around 20 feet. Carpenter would continue to approach it cautiously. As he got closer, he definitely could see for certain the object was hovering. Then, just underneath it, Carpenter would spot 5 humanoid beings below the craft. The entities were around 4 feet tall and were walking around with some sort of jars. They appeared to be using something like tweezers and were taking samples of things like twigs and leaves. They stayed very close to the craft as it hovered just above them. Sometime when Carpenter had seen the beings, the humming sound had stopped. Interestingly, like so many other cases, the beings wore a one-piece tight-fitted suit that covered their whole body. The being's face looked human, but it was devoid of any emotion. This has led some to speculate the entities were robots and were created to blend in just in case someone witnessed them. Carpenter would say their noses were different, appearing pig-like, and he wasn't sure if they had ears as he couldn't see any. As he was watching the beings, Carpenter kept moving closer and closer until he finally was around 10 feet away and staying somewhat hidden. The beings had been looking down for the most part, but then one suddenly looked up and saw Carpenter. He stared at him with its eyes, devoid of emotion, and without even signaling the others, they stopped taking samples. The craft then descended down, and all the beings boarded. The craft then slowly ascended, and there was a white light that flashed, and instantaneously, it flew away. What can we make of this close encounter of the third kind? It has many similar characteristics we see in other cases, such as the buzzing sound and the gray tight-fitted suits that we see often. In addition, there are numerous cases where beings have been seen taking samples. One such case we covered on a previous episode happened in 1967 in Cusack, France. A boy and his sister spotted a craft and some beings taking samples. One of the big questions in this case concerns the beings. It seems that looking so similar to humans, they were either robots or possibly hybrid beings. Many speculate that hybrid beings live among us, although there seems to be no proof supporting this. It's not known if Harold Carpenter ever had any more close encounters or woke up again to a buzzing sound. Still, if there's any lesson to be learned from this case, it's that if you hear a buzzing sound in the woods, walk the other way. On the morning of August 12th, 1983, one of the most famous alien encounters in the town of Aldershot, England would occur. This older case continues to be extremely controversial among ufologists and locals to the area. That said, this close encounter of the third kind is quite interesting and one that deserves examination. In this episode, we will explore the Alfred Burtoo alien encounter. Sometime after midnight on August 12, 1983, 77-year-old Alfred Burtoo grabbed his fishing gear and with his dog Tiny began heading down to the desolate Basingstoke Canal for some night fishing. After checking out a few spots, Alfred finally picked his fishing spot around 1 a.m. Then around 15 minutes later, Alfred would spot a bright light heading toward him. It settled down around 300 feet away, right next to the path next to the canal. After seeing the light, Alfred didn't think too much of it, as there was a military base just nearby. He poured himself a cup of tea and kept fishing, but soon things would get strange. First, Tiny began barking furiously in the direction of the light. Alfred, with eyes on the water, commanded his dog to stop, but Tiny wouldn't. Alfred then glanced over and saw two dark humanoid figures coming in his direction. He couldn't make out specifics on the beings at first, but Alfred wasn't too worried. This is because Alfred had a military background, and he initially believed the figures might just be coming to check on him. As Alfred smoked his cigarette, he began to make out more details on the figures. They kept approaching, and although he wasn't scared, he surely was becoming curious. The beings got closer and closer. Then, he would spot more details. They were around 4.5 feet tall, wearing green coveralls that covered their whole body. He would later recall there were no buttons or zippers, and it was as if the suit was molded to their bodies. Alfred couldn't see their faces, as the beings wore a green helmet with a black visor. The entities would get around 5 feet away and stop. Both stared at Alfred for several moments, while Tiny continued barking. Then they gestured to him to come along. Alfred would begin following them toward the light. One being walked in front, while another one walked behind him. At this time, Alfred was more curious than scared. He would later recall that some of this had to do with his military training, and some of it had to do with his age and failing health. As he approached the ship, which rested in the air, Alfred would climb the stairs along with the beings. As he entered the room, he had to duck down slightly as to not hit his head. The room was all black and had 8 sides and was warmer than the outside. It had a foul smell, which Alfred compared to rotting meat. As he looked around, he would spot no bolts or screws in the walls, and it appeared to be smooth all over. During this time, Alfred could see the beings out of the corner of his eye. Then he heard some sort of noise, and the beings disappeared behind the wall. It's not clear if they just went through it, or a silent door just slid open, but now Alfred was standing in the room, all by himself. After a few minutes, in the middle of the room, a large shaft rose up from the bottom. Right next to it were 2 more beings, almost identical in appearance to the first 2. The shaft was large, around 4 feet in circumference. Then Alfred would be instructed to come over and stand under the light. He couldn't see any light, though, in the room. He stepped over to the right, and an amber light was right on him. It was glowing from ceiling to floor. He stepped into the light with no hesitation. While the light was shining on him, one of the beings would ask his age. Alfred responded that he would be 78 at his next birthday. He was instructed to turn around, and once he did, the being said, "You can go. You are too old and infirm for our purposes." Somewhat surprised, he left the craft and went back to his fishing spot. There he would grab a sip of tea and notice about an hour had passed. Alfred alleged to be unfazed by the experience and got back to fishing. As he was doing this, he would hear a noise from the craft and also see a bright white light. The craft then shot off into the night sky. Shockingly, Alfred would continue to fish all night, and then around 10 a.m. several policemen would walk by. He would mention the craft in his experience, and astonishingly, one of the policemen didn't seem surprised and even mentioned it was probably here to check out the military base. As the weeks progressed, Alfred found himself thinking more and more about that night in his experience. He wasn't sure of many things, but he did want answers. In October of that year, he decided to reach out to the local newspaper, the Aldershot News, in hope that someone else had seen the craft that night, or perhaps had had a similar experience. Alfred wouldn't find any other witnesses, but the event would draw the attention of several ufologists, such as Timothy Good, who would investigate the case. Good believed Alfred and thought he was telling the truth, although he wished that he would have tried to ask more questions to the beings. What can we make of this incredible story by Alfred Burtoo? Like many cases, there appears to be some things that make it seem genuine, while other aspects that make it seem fabricated. Many skeptics have questioned the story at hand. Some asked how Burtoo was able to remain so calm through the event. Also, what about his dog? It seemed to stay behind at the fishing spot, but some think the dog would have insisted on coming along. In addition to this, it's never good from a credibility perspective to wait months to report a story like this. This is somewhat of an unfair criticism, as it's understandable how people just want to move on with their lives. Still, Alfred was 77 and didn't seem to be scared of much. Several things in the story also align with other UFO reports. For one, the beings were near a military base. It's well documented, even in present day, that UFOs seem to get spotted near military installations. There's various theories on this, which include scary ones, like they are gathering intelligence data and assessing our defenses, and other ones suggesting they are just curious about our capabilities. One interesting case that has incredible similarities is the 1971 Finland forestry alien encounter, which we covered on this channel not too long ago. In that case, the being is described almost exactly the same way. The being in that case had green coveralls with a green helmet and a black visor. The only difference between these two cases, in terms of the beings, is that in the Finland case, the beings were described as 2 feet tall, while Alfred said they were around 4 feet. The Finland case happened 7 years before Alfred's encounter. Alfred alleged in the encounter the beings didn't want him because of his declining health. This is something we've seen in other cases as well, and not too surprising. Alfred had mixed emotions on this decision by the beings, though, as a part of him wanted to travel through the universe and get to do things few have done. With his declining health, Alfred would die several years after the encounter. There's rumors that a strong military presence now controls the area where the event occurred. It's reported to be tough to get into and out of, and some speculate the military has recovered crafts or possibly been in contact with the beings. Of course, none of this is known for sure. While we might never get the answers we want in the Alfred Burtoo incident, it surely is an interesting case to examine. In 1977, one of the most strange alien encounters in the history of the Pacific Northwest would happen. The case stands out not only for the incredibly bizarre being the boy encountered, but also because physical evidence remained after it. In addition to this, 2 veteran UFO investigators would examine the case, and both found the witness's story to be highly credible. In this episode, we will examine the alien encounter of Jose Cantu. On January 19, 1977, in the town of Harrow, Washington, 9-year-old Jose Cantu woke up early, headed into the kitchen, and began making his breakfast. That day, Jose's father had already left for work, and rather than wake up his mom, Jose decided to let her sleep. It was around 6:30 a.m. when Jose would glance out the window and see it. He wasn't sure what it was at first, but knew it was unlike anything he had ever seen. After a few seconds, Jose ran into his mother's room and woke up his mom, Martha, telling her something was outside. However, the exhausted mother didn't believe him. Jose persisted and kept asking his mom to come look, but she refused, rolling back over and going to sleep. After a minute or two, Jose left his room and decided it was time to go outside and get a closer look. As Jose approached, he decided to go and hide behind a shed. In a few moments, he peeked out and would be stunned to see not one, but two greenish creatures. The beings appeared to be robotic in nature, or at least partially. Unlike most close encounters of the third kind, the beings weren't humanoids. They had no legs and appeared to have a long base, which rotated in a circular pattern, and below this, on the very bottom, there was something, possibly tiny wheels. The being had short arms and a large round head in which two antenna-like devices protruded. Perhaps even most odd, the being had one large eye in their face and also had a pig-like nose. Behind the creature sat two UFOs, and Jose stated he could see another one of the strange beings inside it. It's important to point out here it's not evident how specifically he saw this. After a few minutes, the two beings would turn and head towards the craft, with one heading toward each UFO and climbing up a ramp. The UFOs then ascended and disappeared into some type of cloud. Jose then ran inside and once again told his mom what happened. However, she still didn't believe him and told him to get ready for school. As Jose got to school, he would continue to tell others though, and soon a teacher's aide named Diane Gomez would hear Jose out. Diane knew Jose well and described him as being very serious. As such, she didn't think he would be creating this story. She and several other aides decided to take Jose home around 10 a.m. and have him show them what happened. As they arrived there, Jose would show the places the beings were. Diane and others would be amazed at the physical evidence as they could see indentations on the ground. Martha would come outside too and see the strange indentations. As she glanced at them, she realized she should have listened to her son. She would later tell the press that if her son ever called her to come and look, she would do so without hesitation. After looking at it for some time, Martha would head inside and call a neighbor named Irene Sanchez. Martha asked Irene to come over so she could get her opinion. Around this time, the aides took Jose back to school, and Martha and Irene would continue to investigate. They would find a 10-foot circle where the grass had been pressed behind the garden. Later that evening, Jose's dad would return home too and see everything. Word would soon spread around Jose's encounter, and soon two UFO investigators, Bill Vogel and David Akers, would arrive. It was a few days after the incident, and the circle indentations were still visible. The men would run several tests and note there was no radiation present. Both men would interview Jose and find his story to be consistent and for him to appear credible. Vogel would note the area has a long history of UFO sightings and bizarre activity like cattle mutilations. Furthermore, there appeared to be UFO sightings and reports of strange lights in the area leading up to the event. Still, what can we make of this case? Was this just one boy's imagination gone wild? Or did this boy have a run-in with a very bizarre looking extraterrestrial? In general, it's our opinion the case seems pretty credible. However, skeptics have pointed out several weaknesses in the case. First, the story relies solely on one eyewitness, a boy, in the interviews, which were conducted by biased ufologists who probably asked leading questions. Second, the being was incredibly bizarre and seems like the figment of a young boy's imagination or something out of a cheap sci-fi movie. Still, as many point out, this is a bit of a double-edged sword, as if a person was going to make up an encounter, it would probably make more sense to include Greys or Nordic beings. We've covered many cases involving some pretty weird beings. One other thing skeptics also point out is the boy wasn't clear how he was able to see the inside of the craft, the beings inside it. However, this might have been a detail that he mentioned but wasn't recorded for whatever reason. All this said, the case does certainly have some credible characteristics to it. The Mr. Cloud is something we see from time to time. There are various theories as to what this is exactly, but this does show up in other cases. One example is the 1954 Ayacucho, Peru encounter, an incident we covered on this channel in which a being used the mist to disappear. Other cases involve people driving into mist only to come out on the other side with hours of missing time. One other factor that seems to have credibility is the witness. Jose was known to be a serious and honest boy, and it's tough to imagine that a 9-year-old could create a story like this and fool several UFO investigators and educators as well as his parents. In addition to this, there was physical evidence, indentations, and flattened grass left at the scene. Some skeptics say the evidence could have been easily created. Still, it seems unlikely the boy could have created this without his parents knowing and doing it by himself. It also doesn't seem likely the parents would have created it either. If they were in on it, why wouldn't Martha allege to see the UFO too, and the alien as well? In sum, the story of Jose Cantu is surely an interesting one, and perhaps one day someone else will report these odd entities. During the 1950s, UFO sightings and alien encounters were prevalent around the world. While the United States appeared to be the epicenter of activity, Europe had a large number of unexplained UFO sightings. In particular, Italy experienced a number of incredible sightings, some of which we have covered on prior episodes on this channel, like the Sannina case, or the 1954 football game in which thousands spotted a UFO over the stadium. In this episode, we will cover a UFO sighting, an alien encounter that occurred just prior to the 1954 football game. It is said to be one of the better known alien encounters in Italy. In time, this case became to be known as the 1950 Varese Incident. On the evening of April 24, 1950, Bruno Ficini, a mechanic, was working the late shift in his local factory during a violent thunderstorm. Bruno was 40 years old at the time and married with a young son. He lived right next to the factory, which was located in Varese, about 50 miles from the city of Milan. Around 10 p.m., once the rain and lightning stopped, Bruno stepped outside to have a cigarette. As he relaxed, he would soon see a strange light flashing in a field across the way. Bruno was somewhat concerned as the lights were where a high-voltage power line was. He believed the line, which supplied power to much of the town, may have been knocked down. He was concerned that a downed power line could be extremely dangerous, since children like his often played in the area. After not seeing the light for a few moments, he decided to head back. Just as he was turning around, he noticed the flashing lights once again. Bruno decided to walk to get closer and see what it was. As he got up closer, Bruno would see something next to the power line. It was some sort of craft, around 30 feet wide and 10 feet across. There was a small ladder in the middle, lit by a greenish light. Bruno could make out what he believed was a human. It appeared to be making repairs or welding something together. There were also two other figures. They all were wearing gray tight-fitted suits and helmets obscuring their appearance. At this point, Bruno believed they were humans and yelled out if they needed help. He believed it could have been some type of experimental craft, possibly American. They muttered something back, though he couldn't understand. Bruno would later state they spoke in a guttural language, which he couldn't make out. Despite this, Bruno indicated he thought they tried to wave him inside the craft. Not only was their language weird, but they also moved awkwardly. At this point, he was able to see more strange aspects of the UFO. He then realized these figures weren't human. He suddenly became terrified, panicked, and started running away. At this point, one of the beings shot Bruno with a ray of light. The beam of light knocked him to the ground, and Bruno hit his head on a rock. As he laid there bleeding, he could see the ladder go up into the craft and the light coming through a door. The buzzing around intensified, and the craft took off into the sky. The following day, Bruno reported his encounter to the police. At the scene, there were things indicating something did happen the night before. Police found burn patches on the ground and indentation marks of something very heavy. Also, police discovered some weird, green pieces of a metal-like substance. Bruno believed this was from the welding, and that the green pieces of debris were leftovers of the process. The fragments were analyzed, and the results concluded that the fragments were an anti-friction material containing several types of metal along with a lubricant. One test revealed some sort of unknown metal. It was a yellow-white color, but was not any type of element found on Earth. A photo was taken after the event of Bruno with his clothes from that night. In the photo, the clothes appear to be blackened somewhat. Bruno received quite a bit of media attention after the incident and was interviewed multiple times after the event. It is said that Bruno's story has remained consistent over the years. Still, with many reports on the matter, it appears some details may have been lost in translation. For example, the outfit the beings are wearing is said in some reports as being more like a spacesuit than a dive suit. Also, some reports say that Bruno was at home, while others say he was nearby. His home was right next to the factory, and this could have been something misinterpreted somehow. Still, what can we make of this case? Bruno's case certainly seems realistic and has many elements we have seen in other UFO sightings and alien encounters. The one interesting detail to call out is the buzzing sound. This is a unique detail and something we've seen in other cases. On this channel, we covered at least 2 episodes where we saw this. This includes the Amjarve, Finland alien encounter and also the Udo Wartina incident. In addition to being a pretty credible witness, there was evidence at the scene. Police would find massive marks on the ground, and the results of the material discovered were inconclusive. In sum, this case appears to have some very credible aspects.